This is the Serrana Bank. It's little more than a barren atoll in the middle of the Caribbean. But as barren as it is today, even the little vegetation it does have didn't exist just a few hundred years ago. And in the 1500s, a man would find himself stranded on this tiny patch of coral for years. But that's not all. There's one other strange detail about his story that's been a mystery ever since. This is that horrifying story, and as always, viewer discretion is advised. Before we get into the video, I just want to quickly mention to everyone who listens while they work, drive, and especially those who listen to sleep, I've organized the videos into playlists on Spotify, Apple Music, and other platforms, so you can just click play and they'll run in the background. Importantly though, there are also 6 audio-only episodes on there that never got turned into videos. So if you want some new extra content to listen to after this video, you can check it out using the link in the description or in the pinned comment. Sometime in the 1520s, a Spanish sailor named Pedro Serrano found himself alone in the Caribbean Sea. The story, as it was later told, begins with a wreck somewhere off the coast of Central America, near a dangerous group of shoals and islands that most sailors knew not to approach. Pedro had been aboard a ship traveling through those waters when disaster struck. What exactly happened has never been revealed, but whatever it was bad enough for the vessel to be completely lost along with everyone aboard except Pedro. He apparently survived simply because he knew how to swim, and after the wreck, Pedro fought through the rough waters until he reached a small island. Being wrecked so close to land must have felt like a blessing to Pedro, but once he dragged himself out of the water, he realized how bad the situation actually was. The island he found himself on was tiny, low, exposed, and at the time almost completely barren. It's believed Pedro landed on what is now called the Serrana Bank, which is an atoll about 31 miles or 50 kilometers in length, with the vast majority of it actually sitting beneath the surface of the ocean. The actual land available to him was about 7 miles or 11 kilometers around, and the island was one of several surrounded by shallow water and reefs. Ships even avoided the whole area because those same very shoals were so treacherous. What this meant for Pedro, though, was that he was now stuck on an island with very little chance of spotting a passing ship, let alone a passing ship spotting him. After pulling himself out of the water, Pedro searched the island and found almost nothing. The island at the time was completely devoid of trees, grass, fresh water, and anything that could be used as firewood. There was no sign of anything that might feed him, shade him, keep him warm, or give him much to work with at all. He had escaped a merciful death in the sea, only to end up in a place that would kill him much more slowly. All he really had was what remained of the clothes on his back and the knife on his belt. And so, as that first night came on, there was nothing for him to do but face what had happened. Amid the sound of the surrounding water lapping on the shore, Pedro tossed his predicament around in his mind and quickly broke into sobs. He spent much of that first night crying and lamenting his fate before eventually succumbing to exhaustion and falling asleep. When the sun began to show over the horizon hours later, Pedro woke up in the sand feeling the same despair he had wept over the night before, but he resolved to at least do something that might help his situation. As the morning daylight flooded the island, Pedro started walking, searching the edges of the shore and looking for anything in the sea that might have washed up. He was still without water, wood, and protection from the sun, but along the surfline he found little things that would help sustain him, including shrimp, crabs, and various other shellfish. It wasn't much, but even still, Pedro gathered what he could and ate it raw because he had no fire and no way to make one. It was a miserable meal that he choked down, but it would keep his stomach satisfied for a few hours at least. The day went on, and so did Pedro, walking up and down the shoreline until he stumbled on a sight he didn't expect at all. Ahead of him on the beach were dozens and dozens of sea turtles. They had come out of the water and crawled onto the island, likely doing so to lay their eggs. He watched the turtles for a while, waiting until they were far enough away from the water, and once they were, he rushed toward them. Then, picking one of them out, he managed to flip the turtle onto its back, where it struggled helplessly and was unable to right itself quickly enough to escape him. Pedro then did the same with as many as he could, and he soon found out which turtles to target and which ones he had to let go. Some of them were just too large for him to overpower, and he figured out the hard way. Apparently, after pouncing on the backs of several of the largest turtles, they would begin to carry him into the sea as he fought to try to get them overturned. It only took a few instances of this for him to realize that the smaller turtles were the ones he should target. Once he had many of them flailing around in the sand on their shells, he pulled out the knife he had attached to his belt and killed them one by one, drinking their blood in place of water before moving on to the next. After he had drunk his fill, he went to work harvesting the meat. Without fire, he was once again forced to consume what he found raw, but he also cut the turtle meat into strips and set them out in the sun to dry out. With the shells, Pedro planned to use them to collect rainwater. In the region he was now inhabiting, when rain did come, it could fall hard, and the shells now gave him the opportunity to capture as much of it as possible for drinking water. Now that he had food and a way to collect water, Pedro moved on to figure out his next problem, which was a lack of fire. Without fire, he could probably manage to stay alive, but with it, he'd be able to stay warm at night, cook his food, and keep his spirits higher. Most importantly though, fire produced smoke, and smoke was a language that sailors understood. A column of smoke rising from a place where no one should be could only mean that someone was stranded there, and if Pedro hoped to be rescued one day, he'd need it to signal ships far off in the distance. Making a fire on that island was next to impossible though, without some ingenuity. It wasn't like he could just find a few sticks to rub together, since there were no trees anywhere on the island. To make fire, Pedro would need to find stone, steel, tinder, and fuel, most of which were again absent at the time. He had steel in the form of his knife and he could make tinder out of his clothing, but he still needed a stone that could strike a spark. Pedro searched the island again and found nothing useful, so he turned to the sea. Swimming out from the island, Pedro dove to search the bottom for pebbles that might serve as a flint. Again and again, he disappeared under the water, only to return to the surface with nothing. It was exhausting work, but eventually his persistence paid off. He managed to find some stones that could work and brought up as many as he could. Back on dry land, Pedro broke some of the stones against others to fashion sharper edges and make them more likely to produce a spark. When he had the stones exactly like he wanted them, he tested them against his knife. Sure enough, Pedro was able to produce the sparks he'd need to get a fire going. Now he'd need something to catch the sparks, so he tore fibers from his shirt and shredded them as finely as he could until they were light and soft. Setting the threads from his shirt onto the sand, he struck the stone with his knife over and over again, and after many attempts, a spark finally caught. Pedro now had fire. Making the fire was only part of the problem though. Keeping it alive was going to be extremely challenging. He turned once again to the sea and began collecting whatever he could find. Before long, he had gathered a considerable supply of dry seaweed, driftwood, shells, fish bones, and pieces of wreckage from ships that had made their way onto the shore. This would end up being a never-ending pursuit just to keep the fire going, and Pedro gathered items almost constantly. Just about every hour of every day, he wandered the island and brought back as much fuel to keep his fire going as he could. At some point during these many salvaging missions, Pedro considered that the rain would be the biggest threat to keeping his fire burning. So using some of the turtle shells, he built a crude shelter over the flames. Little by little, in his first few weeks as a castaway, Pedro was learning the island and coming up with ways to overcome its lack of natural resources. This, of course, boosted his morale and increased his belief that he would eventually be rescued, but just how long could this last? As it turned out, it was a horrifying amount of time. Days and weeks became months, and months inevitably became years without Pedro flagging down a passing vessel. 3 years passed on that island, and Pedro somehow managed to survive his ordeal by repeating the same routines. He scoured the shoreline for food to eat and things to burn, he hunted turtles and collected rainwater in their shells to keep himself hydrated. Only now he was doing all those things completely naked. Within 2 months of his arrival on the island, the little clothing he had left began to fall apart. Between the heat, rain, salt, and damp air, his clothing rotted until it was completely useless. Now totally exposed to the elements, he had to survive with nothing between the tropical sun and his skin. Insects also fed on him constantly, and the only relief was creating enough smoke from the fire to clear them away. When the heat became too much, his only option was to head to the water and submerge himself in the sea. On top of all of this, Pedro had to sit by and watch as ships went past his island, either not seeing his smoke or outright ignoring it because of the dangerous shoals surrounding the atoll. As time went on like this, Pedro became so desolate that he would have accepted death as an escape from it. To him, a quick death began to look preferable when the alternative was waking up each morning to the same sand, heat, hunger, and tasks that drained what little energy he had. All the while, Pedro's body changed in significant ways. His hair and beard grew so long that both eventually passed below his waist, and his skin became weathered and leathery. Accounts of his ordeal compare the sight of him to that of a wild boar as he took on a look that was becoming more and more inhuman. One afternoon, this would come into play when Pedro suddenly spotted a man stumbling along the shoreline of his island. It was one of those moments when Pedro had to question whether he was dreaming or if his mind was playing tricks on him. For 3 years, he had been completely isolated and alone, so it seemed improbable that another person would suddenly show up on the shores, but there he was. This newcomer, who was never named in any of the accounts, as it turned out, had been shipwrecked the night before on the same deadly shoals that surrounded Pedro there years earlier. Somehow he survived by clinging to a plank from the broken vessel, and then when daylight came, he saw the smoke from Pedro's fire on the nearby island, so, helped by the plank, he made his way toward it. For Pedro, this should have been the answer to 3 years of constant loneliness, but when the two men saw each other, they ran in the opposite directions in terror. Pedro believed he was being visited by the devil who had come in human form in an effort to tempt him. Meanwhile, the stranger looked at Pedro, who was naked, covered in hair, and altered by years on the island, and thought he was seeing the devil in his proper form. As Pedro ran away from the newcomer, he called out to Jesus to deliver him from the devil. The newcomer heard Pedro invoking Christ and stopped in his tracks. Whatever this being was that he had come upon was calling out to the same God he knew, so the man turned back and called to Pedro, telling him not to run and that he was a Christian too. Pedro, though, still didn't trust him, so the newcomer began reciting the creed out loud. This finally was enough to convince Pedro that he had encountered another human instead of the devil himself, so he turned back and the two men began to approach one another. When they finally met, they fell into embrace and both of them began weeping. They groaned over what had happened to them and where they had been left to live, and both were so grateful to encounter another living soul that all the fear of their first moments together disappeared. Pedro obviously hadn't been rescued, but he was no longer alone on this island, which was something worth rejoicing in. After a long moment of holding on to one another, the two finally broke apart, and Pedro led the newcomer to his camp. Understanding that the man must be hungry, Pedro gave him some food and water from his own supplies, which the newcomer quickly consumed. With their stomachs full, the two men sat around Pedro's fire and told each other what they had been through. From that moment on, they would live together on the desolate island, and Pedro now had another set of hands to help him with the many tasks that went into simply surviving there. The two men would go on to schedule their days and divide the hours between them. One could search for items in the shoreline while the other tended to the fire. One could rest while the other kept an eye on the horizon. It was beneficial in many ways for both of them, and they realized they needed each other to survive the ordeal. Unfortunately, this wasn't enough to stave off the potential of resentment. After only a short time together on the island, the two men got into a fight. One accused the other of not doing his part and not taking enough care in what had to be done. As they argued, their anger grew and their words turned sharp. It didn't come to blows, but their disagreement was enough for them to separate their camps. For a while afterward, the two men lived apart on the same tiny island, almost splitting it down the middle. Pedro would stay on his side and the newcomer would keep to his, but eventually both men realized how foolish this was. Neither of them could afford an enemy considering the circumstances, so they eventually met up and made peace with one another. Then once again they resumed their shared life together, working to keep the fire lit and keep themselves fed and hydrated. Before the newcomer arrived on the island, Pedro had already endured 3 long years alone. Now with company, he suffered through 4 more. For 7 years, he managed to live in a place where on the first day, it seemed he couldn't survive a single week. By then, both men had drastically changed by the conditions they were living under. The newcomer, who had once been frightened by Pedro's appearance, began to look like him. His clothes rotted away too, and his hair and beard grew uncontrollably. His skin was punished by the same sun and salt that had weathered Pedro's, and the island had turned both of them into the same kind of creature. Throughout this period, ships continued to pass in the distance without a single one of them spotting the smoke, forcing Pedro and his companion to watch rescue just sail right past them. All they needed was just one ship to pass close enough to the island, and the moment finally came when a ship appeared as much more than a dot on the edge of the sea. After all of their time on the island, they watched as the ship came into view and began making its way closer to their location. Because of the dangerous shoals surrounding it, the vessel could only get so close to the island before deploying a smaller boat to check things out. Just as Pedro did years before, the two men understood how they looked. They no longer appeared to be ordinary sailors and more closely resembled beasts than humans. So with a boat full of sailors coming toward them, Pedro and his companion worried they would have the same reaction the two men did when they met 4 years earlier. If that happened, a rescue could fail at the very last moment. The sailors might see them, panic, turn the boat around, and row right back to the ship without them. So in an effort to prevent this from happening, the two men began calling out before the boat even reached the shore. Together, they loudly recited the creed and invoked the name of Christ. Thankfully, this tactic worked perfectly. The boat came in, and the sailors took them away from the island and back toward the ship. It's hard to imagine what that first step onto a vessel must have felt like for the two men. For 7 long years, Pedro had been held to a small piece of land, and now he was watching that same slice of land become smaller and smaller as the ship departed. When the 2 castaways were brought aboard, the other sailors on the ship were astonished by what they looked like. Not only did they barely resemble humans, but their story sounded impossible. But in any case, they were welcomed by the crew and well taken care of as the ship sailed back towards Spain to bring the men back home. For one of them, however, this would never come to fruition. During the voyage, Pedro's companion died of causes that were never revealed in accounts of the story. After all he had survived through, the unnamed man never got a chance to return to the world he once knew. Pedro, on the other hand, did make it back to Spain. Despite his unsightly appearance, Pedro was not in any rush to cut his hair or trim his beard. Instead, he kept himself exactly as he was on the island because it was evidence of all that he had been through. Before he could even say a word to anyone, it was abundantly clear that he had been through something extraordinary. And as he traveled, he would acquire the stares of countless people. Some even gave him money to help him on his way, giving Pedro the idea of putting himself on display as a way to earn income. It wasn't lost on him that he had spent years of his life longing to be seen, and now he was being seen almost too much, but it did reportedly earn him a living after his ordeal. Eventually though, Pedro came before the Spanish emperor and told the harrowing story of his unlikely survival. After seeing him and hearing what he had to endure, the emperor granted Pedro an income of 4,000 pesos, ultimately granting him a whole new life. Sadly, however, he would never get to live it. Pedro sailed back across the Atlantic, apparently on his way to collect or enjoy the reward he had been given, and died shortly after arriving in Panama. The atoll he endured on would eventually be named Serrana Bank in his honor. Pedro's story is a compelling tale of survival that was first published in Inca Garcilaso de la Vega's Comentarios Reales de los Incas in 1609, many years after Pedro's death. As time has passed, Pedro's story has been relayed countless times in other accounts, both written and verbal. As you might imagine, those accounts often differ and take certain liberties. What you just heard was a combination of those accounts wrapped into one narrative. In some accounts, Pedro never has a companion with him on the island. In others, Pedro never puts himself on display for money after his rescue. So all of this begs the question, is any of it true? Well, maybe and maybe not. Unfortunately, historians haven't been able to come to a consensus on this. Garcilaso's telling of the story was reportedly secondhand from someone who claimed to have known Pedro, which invites all sorts of speculation on the veracity of that original account. To his credit, Garcilaso's version is detailed and well-rounded in many ways, but it falls short in others. He goes to great lengths to describe how Pedro figured out how to kill the turtles and make a fire in a place where it was impossible to do so. Yet he doesn't give an exact year that Pedro became a castaway or a precise location of the island. Again, Serrana Bank is believed to be the setting of the story, but Garcilaso's account actually never mentions it. And there's another reason Pedro's story is so difficult to pin down. There is another nearly identical castaway story that existed nearby. Both occurred in the same general time frame, in the same region, on the same type of island, and involved the same basic nightmare. It's the story of a sailor named Maese Joan, and much like Pedro, we know very little about him outside of his ordeal itself. Maese Joan means something like Master John, and that's about all history provides before the story begins, a story that in many ways is harder, stranger, and possibly more convincing than Pedro's. It begins in 1528 when Joan left Santo Domingo aboard a ship that bounced around the Caribbean. After several stops, the ship was caught in a violent storm that tore away the mast and all the sails. The hull eventually opened and water poured in, but the ship did not immediately sink. For 6 days, the fractured vessel drifted through the storm before it struck the shoals surrounding an area known at the time as the Serrana Keys. When the vessel broke apart, Joan jumped to the sea and swam to the island before returning to the wreckage to help the others reach land too. The Serrana Keys were described as a group of shoals, sandbars, and barren islets in the western Caribbean. The account describes a place with no trees, no grass, no water, and nothing that could be fashioned into shelter. It was as inhospitable a place to land as there was on Earth. During the hottest months of the year, no rain fell there, and breakers crashed around the shoals so violently that ships kept their distance. Joan and the other survivors had landed somewhere that couldn't really support life, so they began with the same logic that appears in Pedro's story. They ate what they could find, and over the course of nearly 2 months, they survived on raw meat and the blood of seals and sea cows that came to the island. For a while, there were several survivors with Joan, giving them assistance and much-needed company. Eventually, the group decided to build a raft, and when it was finished, the men divided themselves. 3 of them got onto the raft and left to get help, while 3 others, including Joan, remained behind on the island. 4 days later, one of the men who stayed behind became so raving mad that he began biting and eating his own arms. From the wounds he gave himself, the man died in the following days. Joan, meanwhile, kept his wits about him and continued searching the island for sources of fresh water. He dug into the sand using tortoise bones, trying different places and searching for anything beneath the sand. He would eventually end up finding water, but it wasn't exactly clean and clear. In fact, it was so bad that he supposedly had to mix it with the blood of seals just to get it down. For another 2 months, Joan and his companion, who was described as a boy, were without fire. And once again, at some point, Joan set out to change that. Like Pedro, he went to the sea and searched underwater until he found a pebble that he could use to make a spark. once he had managed to start a fire, the two worked tirelessly to keep it burning. Years later, the fire attracted two men from another shipwreck. They had been drifting on the sea on a raft and spotting the smoke came to the island. Together, the four survived for 5 years total. Then, 3 years after the others left on the raft and 8 years after the original wreck, a passing ship finally noticed smoke and went to investigate. There, they found the castaways and swiftly rescued them. All told, Joan's ordeal lasted from 1528 until 1536. Now, while the accounts of Pedro and Joan are not completely identical, they're probably too close to ignore. Both involve Spanish sailors and are set around dangerous shoals of the Western Caribbean. Both tell of barren islands, both include details about survival through marine animals, and both involve a castaway joined by other wrecked men in eventual rescue after an unbelievable number of years. The big difference between the two stories is the tone with which the accounts were written. Pedro's story has the feel of a legend built around a man's endurance in the face of unimaginable circumstances. Joan's, meanwhile, feels less polished and more raw. It's rougher around the edges and reads less like a tale told from distant memory and more like a report of events that occurred. This doesn't automatically make Joan's account perfectly reliable either, as centuries-old survival stories are difficult to verify. But at first glance, it certainly makes it seem more credible. So while it is possible that Pedro and Joan were separate men whose ordeals overlapped, maybe, as some experts have suggested, Pedro's famous story is just a literary copy of Joan's more matter-of-fact story. Unfortunately, there's really no way to know for sure. So, what do you think? Do you think they were the same men, different men with similar stories, or events that even occurred at all? In either case, if these events did occur, they're some of the most miraculous instances of survival in history. If you made it this far, thanks so much for watching. For those of you who listen to fall asleep, I've organized the stories into playlists on Spotify, Apple Music, and other platforms, so you can just hit play and let them run. The link for that is in the description. Also, a huge thanks to everyone who supports the channel on Patreon or as a channel member. We've got early access content on Patreon if you're interested. And finally, if you have a story suggestion, feel free to submit it to the forum found in the description. And hopefully, I will see you in the next one.